Can a homeschooled child go back to school? What do you think? I'm Nicholeen Peck and I homeschooled all 4 of my children, but I'm also known for all of the parenting work I do. I teach all over the world about parenting, good communication, how to build strong family bonds, education, and child development. And I teach all of these things through the lens of the principle self-government. And in this video, we're talking about homeschool. In this video, I'm going to be sharing with you some stories about parents who did send their children back to school after homeschooling and what happened in those stories. And then I'm also going to be talking about what you can do to be successful sending your child back to school if that's something that you are planning on doing. So the answer is yes, a child can go to school after being homeschooled. The child might like the novelty of it initially, but ultimately could end up being a little bit disappointed by the lack of time that they have to pursue some of their own interests, the lack of time that they have to go and see things, and the lack of personal attention. But sometimes a family circumstance makes it so that it's just necessary for the child to go to school during those years, or maybe even indefinitely. And so it is something that can be done. However, there are going to be some things you're going to want to keep in mind. So I had a friend named Jessica, and she homeschooled her 2 oldest children. Those 2 children were very bright, and they were way ahead in their academics. Well, maybe not every area of academics. There might have been 1 or 2 areas that they were maybe more on grade level, but then there were other areas, especially their reading, that they were way ahead. They could understand science and geography way, way above their grade level because those were things that they had been interested in when they were homeschooling. But then Jessica's husband got sick and she was going to have to go back to work. Now, some people will work and homeschool at the same time, but it wasn't possible in this circumstance. So she felt it was necessary for her children to go to public school. Now, this was a very big decision for her to make, and I know it gave her a lot of grief because she really actually wanted to stay homeschooling. She loved the environment that they were creating, but it was what it was. So she prepared to introduce her children to public school, and they had never been before. Now, at this stage of the game, they were still in elementary school. So I can't remember their ages exactly, but I think they were probably aged like 10 and 8 or something like that. And so they were old enough that they'd been to a lot of homeschool and also young enough that they would feel a little bit overwhelmed by this change that was happening. So she definitely tried to prepare them. But there's one thing that was hard to prepare them for, and that was that when it came to grade level stuff, they were really bored a lot of the time. Her children had far exceeded other people's children who were just matriculating through the public school model in so many areas, especially in the math and science and in reading. They absolutely loved reading so much. But there were some other things like maybe history and stuff like that that they were at grade level, and she didn't want them to be in with children that were older than them because socially there's some things that can happen when that occurs as well. And so in the end, they were a little bit bored. They did make it through, I'm sure, and it wasn't like they didn't graduate or anything. They did okay. But there was some academic boredom, and I know that they kept reading things on their own. Now, one thing that she did that I thought was really neat is that she knew every parent is a homeschooler. No matter where your child goes to school, you get to teach your child about how they should interact with their education and socially and their development and everything. And so she made sure that whenever she was with the children at home, that she maintained that really robust learning culture. They learned a lot of things together as a family. They still tried to go on a lot of family outings because they weren't going to be able to have those regular field trips anymore. And so she really tried to make it just as amazing as possible. Now, I want to contrast that story with another friend of mine who homeschooled her 6 children, and their family had some health issues. There were multiple members of the family who struggled with their health, especially the father. And the mother was really wrapped up in helping the father and the family. And so she wasn't super concerned with getting her children way ahead. She knew she had lots of time to get them where they needed to. They were learning and growing, developing just fine, but maybe weren't up to grade level on a lot of things. In fact, were maybe even behind grade level on quite a few things. And then there came a point where she had to go back to work just because of the father's health and everything else. And so she had to transition everybody to the public school. And when she did that, her children were behind. So as opposed to Jessica's family, who were ahead, her children, these 6 children, were behind in quite a few things. And she was really worried that they would feel like they weren't smart, that they might have to go to resource or whatever. But guess what happened? They caught up so quickly. It just was not even an issue, especially because so much of public school is repetitive. So they repeat the same subject matter so often, or often enough, that her children just caught up and didn't have an issue whatsoever. In fact, at the very beginning of each school year, there's always review of all of the stuff that they learned the year before to try to assess where the children are at so that they know what they can accomplish with them and how quickly they can start. So they really didn't have that much of an issue. I mean, there were probably a few things they bumped along with, but by and large, she said, I was amazed how quickly they just caught up with all of the other children. So she didn't feel like it was a really bad circumstance. Now later she did pull the children back out and decided to homeschool them again, and they all did fabulous being pulled out, and they were happy to be back to home life and homeschool. So there are different reasons why people might need to put their children in school, or that they decide to homeschool their children, but it is possible either way to have a good experience. But there were key things that these mothers did when they transitioned their children to school from homeschool that I think are really worth talking about. So what did these 2 mothers do to help transition their children? Let's talk about that. If you have subscribed to this channel already, then you know there's a lot of videos on here about homeschooling, and there's a lot of videos on here about parenting and good communication. Now, one key thing with good communication is pre-teaching. If you're going to train your children to self-govern, pre-teaching is key. That means that you prepare a person ahead of time for what is going to come. This decreases anxiety, helps them deal with little no answers or instructions that are going to come along the way. So there are 4 basic skills to self-government. I talk about those all the time on this channel. At the end of this video, I'll let you know where to go and learn more about those things. But just to mention a couple of them that are really necessary to pre-teach your children. So following instructions. When you homeschool, it's a little looser environment. So they're used to just, okay, what do I want to do? What am I going to do next? What am I going to learn here? How deep do I want to go? They don't get that same opportunity at school. They have to stick to a timeline. There's like bells and things, and oh, we're going to do this for this much time, and then that's it. So they have to learn how to turn it on and shut it off, and they have to learn how to be okay with that. And that is difficult for them. So if they already know how to follow instructions, then they know, okay, well, I need to tell myself I'm going to be doing math for 15 minutes, until this workbook page is done, and then we'll probably transition to something else. And so I only get to go this far. I don't get to keep going. And so they'll have to give themselves that type of an instruction ahead of time so that they're prepared. And then when it's time to stop and everyone has to stop and they don't want to stop yet, then they might have to give themselves a no answer for that and tell themselves, okay, well, later when I get home, I'll go work more on this. And so they might have to schedule in other times to give themselves instructions for those other things they want to pursue. They're going to need to be prepared to follow teacher instructions, administrator instructions, and remember the no answers that you have in your family so that socially they can succeed in this environment, which is going to be very new for them as well. So you'll want them to understand your standards, and that's going to probably be the biggest thing. I did know a family one time who had a couple of children. Well, they homeschooled all their children. I think they had probably like 8 children, but the last 2 they ended up putting into public school after a while. And one of them, I think she was maybe the youngest or second to youngest, one of these last 2, she ended up getting into drugs and bad social stuff and things like that. And the father, I remember him lamenting to me, because I worked with him at the time. And this was before I ever homeschooled or anything. In fact, I probably was pretty critical of homeschool at the time. And he said to me, he said, I don't know why she's getting into all these drugs and all this stuff. She was homeschooled. And I remember thinking at the time, well, homeschool doesn't keep you from ever wanting to do drugs. I mean, that would be nice if it did. You're certainly not surrounded by it as much. And so hopefully you would be insulated from that type of thing and not desire it. But it's not going to protect you from what comes later. And so then he went on to tell me that they had put these last two into school, into high school and stuff like that. And she got in with all the wrong people. And really probably what happened is she was an obliger. And if you haven't seen my video on the 4 tendencies and on being an obliger, then I would definitely look into that, because that can be a thing. If your child's an obliger, they're going to go with the flow. They're going to follow whatever is happening around them. Whoever accepts them into their social group, they're just going to follow what happens there. And so then you could end up with a real big problem on your hands morally. So you want to definitely prepare for that. In the Teaching Self-Government parenting system, we talk about creating a family standard. And I teach all how to do that in the TSG parenting course that I have on my website. That family standard is where you create some instructions and no answers that are standards for your family that you hold to no matter what. And that your children learn that no matter who we're with, no matter where we are, these are things that we hold to. And it prepares them to hopefully not fall for some of those social traps. Because when your children are used to being around people who do a lot of the same things that you and your family do and believe a lot of your same things, and then they're suddenly with people who are different, that can have an impact. And I would say that's probably one of the greatest impacts to transitioning your children from homeschool to school, is there can be a social and even moral impact based on the influences. And so you're going to want to pre-teach them and prepare them really, really well. So now remember, I talked about those 4 basic skills of self-government and where you could find those skills, and that I had a video for you. Well, there was a great video. It will be a perfect overview of some of the nuts and bolts of the Teaching Self-Government parenting system. And that video is called The Not So Known Secret for Parenting Success. So click on the link to that video next, and I'll see you there.